They had a human applicant. Marcus Vael, Deep Reach Division. Someone will challenge him. Good. Let them. The Interstellar Diplomatic Corps had been placing negotiators, arbiters, and senior envoys for 212 years. Its placement rate, meaning the percentage of candidates who completed the full 18-month fellowship and received a coalition posting, was 58%. The Corps did not consider itself selective. It considered itself accurate. The distinction mattered to the people who ran it, which was perhaps why it had survived long enough to develop the kind of institutional gravity that bends everything nearby into orbit around it. The Academy of Diplomatic Practice on Tessavar Station sat at the center of that gravity. 31 species sent their most promising candidates there. The faculty held doctorates, advisory positions, and in several cases had personally negotiated the frameworks that now governed entire sectors of coalition space. The curriculum covered treaty architecture, multi-species cognitive bias, historical conflict resolution, applied linguistics across 9 language families, and something the Academy simply called leverage studies, which was the most heavily subscribed elective in the program's history, and the one most likely to produce candidates who left the fellowship early. Humans had been coalition members for 41 years. Human candidates had been attending the Academy for 23. In 23 years, 16 humans had completed the fellowship. One of those 16 had gone on to hold a senior posting. The current cohort had 1 human candidate. His name was Marcus Vael. He was 31 years old, originally from a mid-range settlement on the edge of the Outer Reach. And he had arrived at Tessavar Station with a service record that his intake assessor had sent to 3 separate verification offices before accepting it as genuine, because the scope of what it described did not align with what the assessor understood to be possible for someone of his rank, his age, and his geographic origin. He had spent 9 years in active deep reach field work before applying to the Corps Fellowship, not advisory work, not observation rotations, field arbitration in active conflict zones, the kind of postings that most senior diplomats spent entire careers avoiding. His record contained 14 independently concluded ceasefire frameworks. 7 of those had been negotiated under conditions his intake assessor had flagged as Category 4, meaning communications blackout, no extraction protocol, and opposing parties who had already rejected coalition mediation at least twice before Marcus arrived. All 14 frameworks were still holding. The oldest had been in place for 6 years. Marcus had not brought this up. He arrived at the station on a Wednesday, located his assigned quarters without assistance, attended his first orientation sessions, and inserted himself into the social fabric of the cohort the way that certain people insert themselves into rooms, quietly, without announcement, in a way that made it seem afterward as though he had always been there. He was not unfriendly. He was not withdrawn. He answered when spoken to and asked reasonable questions during lectures and gave no indication in those first weeks that he was anything other than what his biographical summary suggested. A capable mid-career field worker from an underserved region, who had perhaps, through some combination of effort and fortunate timing, made it into the Corps Fellowship on what most of his cohort quietly assumed was some form of equity provision. The cohort had a way of making such assumptions quietly. That was one of the things a diplomatic education produced. The challenge came in the 5th week. Senior Fellow Osei ran the Conflict Architecture Seminar, a format that placed 12 candidates around a circular table and required them to dissect real historical negotiation failures. The methodology was adversarial by design. Candidates were expected to identify each other's reasoning errors in real time. The ones who thrived in it tended to do well in the field. The ones who didn't tended to find other ways to demonstrate value. The case study that week was the Vettori Compact collapse, a 40-year-old multi-party trade agreement that had disintegrated over 18 months of incremental bad faith, producing 2 armed engagements and a sector-wide trade embargo that cost the affected systems approximately 300 billion coalition credits before a successor framework was concluded. Standard curriculum material, the kind of failure that had enough distance from the present to be examined without defensiveness. Candidate Rael Sunis, a 3rd-year Velhari with 4 generations of diplomatic family lineage, and a name that appeared on 3 different Tessavar Station donor plaques in the main corridor, introduced the human question the way certain candidates introduce questions in seminar settings, not during a natural pause in the discussion, but precisely when another candidate was about to speak, and with the specific inflection of someone who has been waiting. Before we go further, Sunis said, addressing the table in the particular way that somehow excluded the person it was meant to include, it might be grounding to establish what each of us actually brings to conflict architecture from direct experience. Field arbitration as a reference point. A pause. What would the average human field officer have independently concluded by Vael's stage of service? For calibration, several candidates around the table adjusted their posture. Not much, just enough. Senior Fellow Osei, seated at the head of the table with a stylus she had not used once in 5 weeks, said nothing. She had been waiting for something like this since she pulled Marcus Vael's file at the end of the first week and read it twice. Marcus looked at Suni's with steady, dark eyes that Osei had noted, over 5 weeks of seminar, had a specific quality. They registered what was happening in the room without being moved by it. There was a difference between those two things, and it mattered in the field more than almost any other trait, and it could not be taught. That's a useful framing, Marcus said, with the tone of someone who had genuinely found it useful. Do you want the number from my first 4 years, or the full field record? Sunis arranged an expression of patience. Let's say the full record for calibration. Marcus said a number. The table went quiet, not suddenly, the way a sound system cuts out, but progressively like a wave moving through water. The candidates nearest to Marcus went still first, then the ones across the table, as each person's internal arithmetic caught up with what they had heard and started trying to reconcile it against their existing understanding of what was possible for a 31-year-old human from the outer reach, who had arrived on a Wednesday with no family plaques in the corridor. Suni said, with considerably less of the previous patience, that number isn't possible for someone at your posting level. The verification index is attachment 7 in my intake file, Marcus said. The frameworks themselves are publicly archived through the Coalition Conflict Resolution Repository. Most of them have full session transcripts. Senior Fellow Osei placed the stylus on the table. The transcripts, she said to the group, are available through the Academy's research archive. I pulled the relevant files at the end of week 1. She looked around the table. Since we're examining the Vittori Compact's failure as an architecture problem, it seems appropriate to also look at recent successful architectures under comparable conditions. For contrast, she opened the display panel. The seminar room's primary wall became a document environment. What followed was 50 minutes that Osei had structured carefully in the 3 weeks she'd spent deciding when to use it. Because she had read the file and she understood that what it contained was not simply a collection of impressive outcomes. It was a specific and complete education in every conceptual failure mode the Vittori case represented, not as theory but as the exact problems Marcus Vael had walked into without extraction options and resolved. The first framework was the Kasari labor dispute, 4 years old, concluded in 11 days. Osei pulled the session transcript from day 3, the day the Kasari delegation had formally withdrawn from talks, and Marcus had requested a private channel with the opposing party's second-in-command, not the lead negotiator, the second, and spent 4 hours in conversation that the transcript recorded as off-format, meaning Marcus had abandoned the standard arbitration protocol and was operating from something else entirely. By the end of day 3, the Kasari delegation was back at the table. The transcript showed why. The candidates around the table read it in silence. The second case was the Dreneth boundary dispute. 3 parties, 2 of which did not share a language. Marcus had been the only arbiter present and had operated for 6 days without coalition communication support due to a relay failure that the post-mission report characterized as foreseeable and that someone should have caught before deployment. The framework concluded on day 9. The boundary agreement it produced had been cited 4 times since in subsequent coalition mediations as a structural template. Osei moved through 5 cases in the first 30 minutes. She noticed the room. She had taught the conflict architecture seminar for 11 years, and she knew what it looked like when 12 candidates were genuinely recalibrating. It was not the silence of discomfort. It was not the silence of boredom or resistance. It was the particular quality of silence that filled a room when people were actually thinking, when something had arrived that required them to adjust, not their posture, but their understanding. Suni's, by the 4th case, was no longer performing patient. He was reading the transcript displayed on the wall with an expression Osei recognized from her own early career, the expression of someone who had asked a question expecting a particular kind of answer, and was receiving instead a thorough and unhurried education in why the question had been the wrong shape entirely. The 7th case was the one Osei had chosen to place last. It was the most recent, 14 months old, and it was the only one in Marcus's file that had required a Category 4 classification to be applied after the fact. because when Marcus was initially deployed, the situation had been assessed as Category 2. The reclassification happened on Day 4. When the communications relay failed, the extraction protocol was suspended, and both parties announced they were withdrawing from the process entirely. The talks had continued for 11 more days. The framework signed on Day 15 was still in place. Osei turned off the display. The room held its silence for a moment longer than necessary. 12 candidates and 1 senior fellow in a seminar room on Tessavar Station, in the 5th week of an 18-month fellowship, with the accumulated weight of what they had just read settling over the table like sediment. Conflict architecture, O said, is most productively studied not as abstract structure, but as applied decision-making under real constraint. The question of what different backgrounds bring to the work. She looked at Sunis with the precise and entirely neutral expression of a senior fellow who has been doing this for 11 years. Is a genuinely important question. As we've seen, the answers tend to be more specific and textured than general assumptions suggest. The seminar ended. Candidates gathered their materials, pushed back their chairs. Several took routes toward the exit that happened to pass near Marcus's position at the table. They didn't say anything, most of them. But their movement had a specific quality, the quality of people who have updated an assessment and aren't yet certain what to do with the update. Sunis was the last to reach the door. He stopped there, standing with the particular stillness of someone who is finishing a thought rather than beginning a departure. The room had mostly emptied. Only Marcus, Osei, and Sunis remained. The first 4 years, Sunis said to no one in particular, the way someone speaks when they're completing an arithmetic problem out loud, and the full record. You said they were different numbers. By 4, Marcus said. Sunis left. Marcus began stacking his materials. He didn't have much, a tablet, a handwritten notation sheet, the kind of low-tech supplement that some candidates used and most didn't. He looked up at Osei, who was still at the head of the table. You had the files pulled before the first seminar, he said. It was not a question. Before your intake was finalized, Osei said. I was on the review committee. I read your Dreneth transcript the same week you arrived. Marcus looked at her for a moment. He had, Osei had observed across 5 weeks, a way of receiving information that was so specific years in rooms where information could be dangerous, a quality of stillness that was not passivity, but something much more like complete attention. You were waiting for the right case study, he said. The Vittori Compact, Osei said. The parallel to your Kesari framework is almost structural. I wanted the class to see it side by side. Something shifted in Marcus's expression. Not satisfaction. Not anything as simple as satisfaction. The expression of someone who had carried something for a long time and had just briefly been seen carrying it. The Vittori failure, he said, was a leverage problem. Everyone in that room knew what the other side needed. Nobody was willing to be the one who showed they knew. And Kesari? Same problem, Marcus said. Different solution. I went to the second chair because he already knew the lead negotiator was wrong. He just needed someone to say it to who wasn't in the room. He picked up his tablet and the notation sheet. Most negotiation failures aren't information failures. They're permission failures. Someone already has the answer. Nobody's given them permission to use it. He moved toward the door. Vael, Osei said. He stopped. There are 2 senior postings opening in the outer reach sector in the next cycle. She said it the way she said everything, without particular emphasis, as a statement of fact. Both of them have been Category 2 or higher for the past 18 months. Marcus nodded once, the nod of someone filing information. You're telling me as a note, he said. Not as a placement. I'm telling you, Osei said. Because the placement committee meets in 6 weeks and I sit on it, and there's a significant difference between submitting a candidate file and submitting a candidate file with a recommendation from someone who has reviewed the session transcripts. The slight shift in Marcus's expression again. The brief, specific movement of someone allowing themselves, for just a moment, to be acknowledged. I appreciate that, he said. He left. Osei stayed at the table. Window. Tessavar, the seminar room's single high window, Tessavar into its amber evening register, the particular quality of engineered light that did a reasonable impression of a sunset for the species who needed one. She sat with the quiet for a moment. Then she opened the session record on her tablet and navigated to the cohort performance log. Under Marcus Vael's entry, she scrolled past the 5-week summary, attendance, participation metrics, written assessments, the standard documentation, and opened the field for additional senior fellow notation, where the Academy's more experienced faculty occasionally added observations that weren't captured in the structured evaluation categories. She looked at the blank field for a moment. Then she wrote 4 words. "He's been here before." She closed the tablet, gathered her materials, and left the seminar behind her with the soft, certain click of an institution that had been producing its particular kind of excellence for 212 years and would, she suspected, be surprised by Marcus Vael in ways it had not yet finished anticipating.